Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Practice Group, and it's a place for thoughtful conversations on environmental and natural resources law and policy, ranging from the latest developments to perennial topics like litigation, enforcement, and compliance assurance. We're glad you're spending some time with us today. I'm joined today by a couple of my friends from the Policy Resolution Group, Christine Wyman and Liam Donovan. And just a word about our Policy Resolution Group, which is like Bracewell's much cooler younger brother or younger sister. PRG is absolutely incredible in understanding legislative and regulatory developments and representing clients in their strategic communications needs. And they put out some incredible content breaking down the significance of elections, of legislation, and so forth. You should really give them a follow, subscribe to their Lobby Shop podcast and their Madam Policy podcast. PRG is sort of like the OG podcasters in the Bracewell world. And so we're really sort of riding on their coattails here. Welcome, Christine. Welcome, Liam. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be with you.
Good to be here. So today we're going to talk about permitting reform. And I have been hearing about permitting reform, I think at least for a year. And what we're going to talk about today is really what we're talking about when we talk about permitting reform. And I understand, and I know you guys are way deeper into what's going on the Hill when it comes to permitting reform. But I thought it'd be great for our listeners on the environmental side, on the natural resource side, to have sort of a 101 conversation about when what are we talking about with permitting reform? I understand that the permitting reform packages started to solidify around a few key proposals. It does have some content to it. It's not sort of a generic regulatory reform flag that politicians are waving. There's something to it. And so I'm excited to have you on to talk about it. And then maybe we can talk about its prospects and what it looks like during this lame duck session. So Christine, I'd like to go to you first. What is permitting reform?
Great. Thanks, Daniel. So when we're talking about permitting reform, I think it's important to think about it. It means something different for everybody, right? I mean, at a highest level, I think there's a recognition that the environmental review and authorization process for infrastructure projects, and particularly energy infrastructure projects, can be challenging and time consuming and lack some predictability that developers and investors need, and the public too, to take advantage of the benefits that these projects bring to bear. So there's a desire to improve that process. The question, though, is what needs to be fixed and how you go about doing that. And there's a range of topics on the table from regulatory changes to NEPA and Clean Water Act provisions. But there's also a desire within Congress to say, hey, let's look at the statutory provisions that are driving all these federal reviews and authorizations. And is there benefit in opening those up and trying to provide some more coordination and dedication of resources to make sure that we're doing things in a predictable and kind of efficient manner. So, in a global sense, that's what we're talking about, permitting reform. But then, earlier this year, we saw particularly Chairman Manchin, chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, put pen to paper and put together a proposal that was circulated and, tried to be included in funding bills. And I'll let Liam talk to the mechanics and the politics of that. But, Senator Manchin's bill is kind of seen as the starting place right now for when people are talking about permit reform within Congress. It has a lot of different provisions in it, some coordination provisions, some things that would kind of change how energy projects are permitted and the substantive changes there. And it would provide some coordination among the agencies. And I can unpack that a little bit if we want.
Yeah, I think Christine's point is key up top there. And, starting with the opening question, permitting reform is in the eye of the beholder in the same way that infrastructure was. Infrastructure was always the thing that we could agree on because infrastructure is good. And once you get to that next sentence of what that means, it means different things to different people. And so I think that's the challenge here. I think in the abstract, it's something that everybody can agree is important. Everybody can agree needs to be done. And the question is, who are the beneficiaries? What are the means? To Christine's point, in terms of the Manchin effort, I think it's tricky in that usually the way bipartisan consensus comes together, as we saw with the infrastructure bill, both sides start with their version and you sort of work your way to compromise. Where what Manchin did, and it was a good faith effort, was try to end at the compromise position. Right? He tried to negotiate for both sides and end up with the final version of the bill. And just as a practical matter, as a political matter, that's usually not how these things come to fruition, because people have to fight the good fight. They have to feel like they've used their leverage as best they can in order to end up in a place where they say, okay, fine, I don't love this isn't my favorite thing, but I feel invested in it. I have pride of authorship. And that's a key part of getting things done. So I think that was the tricky part of trying to slip this into the funding bill that Christine mentioned. There's a variety of reasons why it wasn't going to happen there, not least because, remember, we're talking about this because it was a sidecar deal to a broader agreement around getting Senator Manchin's vote for the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
And that origin story, the fact that this was sort of part of a side bargain on a deal that they didn't like and sort of certainly didn't want to validate or otherwise participate in, that was why Republicans were out as a matter of principle. Now, backing up, I think Republicans see value in this effort. They might not like this version, but they'd like to continue the conversation to the point when you're hearing from leadership, from the key players in this jurisdiction, that they'd like to do something in Q1. So the choice for Democrats and for particularly leadership is, okay, is this our last best chance? If it is, how do we go about this? And that's why in the last 24 to 48 hours, you've heard a lot of chatter around, well, it's been quiet for several weeks, but now you're hearing sort of a last ditch to where, okay, the NDAA, there's two things left to be done yet this year. It's the defense authorization bill that's going to happen. It always happens. It happens in a bipartisan manner, and government funding. NDAA is set to roll out perhaps today. It might happen while we're talking here. It is likely to pass the House if things go according to plan this week. And so we'll have a good sense by the time this podcast comes out as to whether this actually has legs. And I have my doubts as to how this comes together because of the underlying substantive questions, because of the political dynamics at play. But I think that is the calculus of Democratic leaders, is that things are going to be harder to do when Republicans come in and have more leverage, and they're going to try to do their best and take one last shot down the field here.
Okay, so Liam, you said that it might be harder to do things as far as permitting reform when Republicans show up in the new term. And I have a lot of questions about that, because when I think about permitting reform and regulatory reform, I think about messages we heard from the last administration about making these permitting processes a lot more predictable, decreasing uncertainty. We saw, and listeners of the podcast will remember, we've been talking about waters of the United States issues on this podcast since this podcast was created, because there's been so much back and forth about what the scope of the Clean Water Act is. And that's just one example. We can look at issues over Section 401 certificates. And so the last administration was really interested in reforming this area. So Christine, maybe, and Liam too, why is there a push from the White House? Why is there a push here to clean up this area when we heard about that from the Trump administration every day for 4 years?
Sure. So I can take a stab first. I mean, the administration, one of the cornerstones of their domestic policies is clean energy. And so clean energy projects require much of the same reviews and authorizations that traditional energy projects require. So it's in the administration's best interest to ensure that that's a predictable and efficient process so that they can move out those energy infrastructure projects swiftly. There's a lot of crossover, though, between those types of energy infrastructure projects. If you think of like an electric transmission line, the electrons that are flowing along that, whether they're renewable or they're the result of coal-fired power generation, that doesn't really make a difference, right? So that's why the administration is interested in this, building out transmission lines, carbon dioxide pipelines that are associated with carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. The pipeline permitting process for that, whether it's PHMSA or nationwide permits, Clean Water Act Section 401, those are all things that are going to be imposed on those types of pipelines too, depending on the resources that they impact. So those federal statutes and those regulatory reviews really do apply across the board. And so that's why the administration has a desire to move out this process. At the same time, though, they are looking at what the Trump administration had done on waters of the U.S. and all those same types of statutes and regulatory permitting provisions. And, as Liam said, what types of changes are required differs depending on, who you are, and it's in the eye of the beholder. And so that's why we're seeing these same types of topics continuously being talked about, but we're coming at it from different perspectives.
I think that universal recognition that we talked about up top, that these things take too long and it should be easier and faster, is a central element of how do you get the most out of what you've passed. The 2 years of fruitful Biden legislative activity are over. And now the question is, how do you implement them? How do you actually turn what's on paper as the potential of these funds and the projects that are meant to facilitate, without significant reforms to the permitting process? You're not going to get as much as you expected, as much as you'd like to get out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's why. But it does. I think the premise of the question creates an interesting dynamic, which is this is usually seen as a Republican issue, regulatory reform and whatnot. I think to the question you raised as to why would it be harder, I think it's harder in the sense that you're already, for this version, for the Manchin version, you already have 70 House progressives saying under no circumstances will we vote for this. So if this version is not good enough for them, and Republicans only have more power, more leverage come January, the idea that something more in the image of, let's say, Senator Capito's bill would be acceptable to, you're more likely to lose Democratic votes in the new year than you are to gain them. And so it just means that on balance, whatever could come out of a bipartisan compromise would be nudged in the direction of Republicans to the detriment of the progressive vision for what permitting reform is.
And just before we jump to the next question, there are some interesting themes that we do see across the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and that's on coordination. And that's something that we saw very prevalent in the Manchin legislation, trying to improve the coordination among agencies that are reviewing energy infrastructure projects and infrastructure projects in general. The same types of process improvements were in the Trump administration one federal decision that we see now in the Manchin legislation on, setting the timelines, the dispute resolution, a lot of those things. There's they might use a little bit different words and the verbiage is, changed a little bit, but the intent and the goal there is the same. And so we do see that bipartisan kind of through line.
And one thing that struck me as one of the more controversial items on Senator Manchin's, I guess, bullet list that we saw earlier in the year. Who knows if this is going to make it actually into the text of any proposed legislation. But there were also limitations on who could actually challenge the permit after the permit had been issued, because, we have two sources of uncertainty, I think, in general. You've got your pre-permit review process and what goes into that preparation, that cook for those decisions. And then on the back end, you have no idea who is going to challenge these projects. And in fact, one of Senator Manchin's items related to the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which we've seen has been challenged numerous times over its authorization. So you've got the sort of the coordination problem on the front end, the litigation on the back end, all creating uncertainty. And so it's interesting, Christine, that you highlight that coordination, that certainty, and that we've seen both administrations express an interest in obtaining.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what Liam said about Manchin tried to find the compromise position, and that was his legislation. He tried to read the tea leaves of where both sides needed to end up, and so there you do see in that legislation provisions that limit the time associated with challenging some of these agency decisions, trying to put some predictability and finality associated with the legislation or with the federal reviews and permits. And so that was something that was seen as, limiting the people who could come to the table. At the same time, you see Clean Water Act certification requirements that are expanding what the Clean Water Act review is for the states that are looking at these projects, looking at the project as a whole, broadening the state water quality requirements that they can look at. And so there's really kind of changes on both sides that he tried to predict where people would end up.
So we're going to look forward to seeing some actual language, but I'm also curious, and Liam, you teed this up a few minutes ago, as far as how this permitting reform package would become reality. what are the dynamics for seeing some permitting reform legislation and what remains of this legislative session? And then what do we have to look forward to when the new representatives and senators arrive on the Hill?
Sure. And this has been the case really since September, that last opportunity the first opportunity to put permitting on a moving vehicle. What they did in September was push out the funding deadline to mid-December, which is almost upon us. There's really two loose ends that Congress needs to wrap up. The first is government funding, which is not on track to be dealt with by that mid-December deadline. They're probably going to have to build in another week or 2 weeks. That is being targeted as an opportunity to move some other policies, potentially a tax title, something along those lines. The other one being the defense authorization bill. That is usually a consensus piece of legislation. There's usually like a House version, a House Democratic version, a Senate version that has to be more bipartisan by virtue of the way that chamber works. And there's no formal conference because the Senate didn't pass their version, but there's sort of a very ecumenical process by which both the leaders of the defense jurisdiction work together. And then also they'll typically add policies that might not fall in the defense realm, but have agreement among what we call the four corners, the bipartisan leaders of the respective committees of other jurisdictions. So you'll have things add in that don't necessarily have to do with defense, like permitting. In this case, it's a little bit different because you don't have that bipartisan buy-in. You don't have that sort of it's not the work product of something that's come through regular order. That's typically how these things work. And so that's what makes it a little bit tricky. You definitely don't have the buy-in from leadership, which is usually necessary. I think heading into this election, the expectation was, depending on just how well Republicans did, would determine the incentives for Republicans to cooperate. If they did really, really well, it probably doesn't make sense to cooperate because they can come in, the cavalry's coming, they can get better next year. Obviously, that didn't happen. Republicans had a worse year than they might have expected. That's a problem for a different reason. And it's not that, we didn't have the night we wanted, so maybe we should just get this deal done. The problem is you have a weakened leadership to the point where, for instance, Leader McCarthy, who would obviously be the heir apparent to the speaker, does not currently have the votes to be speaker when the Congress comes back into session on January 3rd. So everything that does or doesn't happen in the next month happens in that context of, is this a development that adds or subtracts votes, or does it complicate his path to the speakership? So I think all of these potential things that could happen in lame duck and attached to NDAA or attached to an omnibus bill, I think have to be viewed through that lens in a sense. The Democratic bet here, to the extent they included in NDAA, is, okay, we're going to take a gamble that this typical, very bipartisan, very orchestrated NDAA effort can sustain sort of something that they essentially jam Republicans in, to use our sort of legislative parlance. This would be daring Republicans to vote it down. And the thing to remember about NDAA and about defense policy in general is you're always going to lose a significant chunk of progressives. And as we mentioned, there's 70 progressives that already said they wouldn't support this bill, but probably half that group wasn't going to support the defense authorization bill to begin with, which in a chamber when Democrats have 220 votes or so, if you take away 40 or 50, you're already relying on 40 or 50 Republicans to cross over, even for a clean NDAA. So if you add this policy that might lose you more Democratic votes, you're asking Republicans to lift even further. And that's the ultimate question is, do Republicans just kind of shrug and say, okay, fine, we don't really mind this that much, let's just go along with it? I don't anticipate that happening. But going back to the original point, which is, depending on what it looks like, if it probably can't be the Manchin package as was originally drafted. They would probably have to drop out things that are seen as controversial, either by the respective parties or by stakeholders. Because that's the thing to remember here. This has not been greased by the industries that are affected. It's not like you have full-throated support from all parties, which is usually how you'd get that kumbaya moment of everybody kind of joining hands and saying we should do this. Republicans haven't felt any pressure because they're not getting pressure from the industries that they represent in their states. And so I think that's my question is, okay, if I'm working backwards from a position where this happened, why did it happen and why were we surprised by this? It's probably that it's more of a slimmed down version of that you could call permitting reform, but the things that have been preventing them from getting there in the meantime have been dropped out to make it less controversial, less of an issue for the stakeholders that have problems with this. If it does pass the House, it still has to go to the Senate, and the Senate would require at least 10 Republican votes. And based on people I've talked to over there, I think they'll wait and see. If it comes to them, maybe it has a head of steam because it would have gotten, like we said, 50 or more Republican votes. In that case, maybe it's a different scenario. But right now, there's just not a big urgency or appetite on the Republican side to get this done, especially because they're going to have more leverage next year. And when they do come in, it might not be the first thing they do when they come in, but they're at least paying lip service to the idea this is something they want to prioritize in the first half of the year.
So it's much more complicated than thinking, as I would have thought, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we can see a variety of industries coalesce around this and get it done. There are so many more dynamics at play, which is why we love having you guys under the same roof.
We focused a lot on what's going on at Congress, but obviously all of these statutes are implemented by the agencies through regulations. And the Biden administration has made a point of trying to improve the permitting process through regulatory reform as well. I think they've been relatively quiet for the first 2 years, but now that we're looking at the last 2 years of this term for this administration, we're expecting several different proposals to come out, notably probably the NEPA reform, phase 2 of that. So I think that's right. Something that we are anticipating to be rather meaningful and aggressive on trying to both provide predictability on the reviews for energy infrastructure and infrastructure in general, but also trying to define, probably from a broader sense, from the Biden administration's priorities on things like community benefits, environmental justice, and things like that, how those types of considerations are expected to be looked at in the NEPA process. So that's something that we're keeping our eyes on. Clean Water Act Section 401, EPA had a pretty aggressive proposal out there, and we're expecting a final rule on that. So more to come on the regulatory side. The administration might use that too as leverage if permitting reform does not pass before the end of the year. And we do see some sort of Republican proposal coming out of the House. The Biden administration might use their aggressive reform policies on the regulatory side to try to leverage some sort of compromise with Congress as well. So more to come. Daniel, at the top, you said you've been hearing about permitting reform for the last year, but I think this is a standard conversation here in DC. And so I expect it to continue for the next year, at least.
Absolutely. With all of the new rulemakings we have to look forward to as well. So thank you, Christine. Thank you, Liam. Thank you for joining us for this and sharing your insights. They're always appreciated. And for our listeners that may not be familiar with the content they put out, you've got to check it out. And we'll talk to you soon. That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests, as well as Dorn, Julia, and Emily, and the rest of our production team who helped to make our podcast possible. And of course, you, our listeners. We'll talk to you soon.